Hello, Janginis. Before we get started, Rich and I want to let you in on some even more exciting updates for our Patreon subscribers.
As you know, Patreon is a site where listeners can pledge a small monthly amount, either $5 or $10, to support the cost of bringing you your favorite podcast. All patrons get early access to new CutOff Jeans episodes before they're released to the public.
But the most exciting new perk is that all of our patrons will be able to listen to an exclusive bonus episode of the podcast every other week. Topics include personal stories that I'm not ready to share publicly, conversations with family and friends.
And sometimes we'll devote an entire episode to other subjects we love, like musical theater or classic television.
Rich and I enjoy bringing you the CutOff Jeans podcast, and it would mean so much if you would consider supporting our labor of love.
Just go to patreon.com/cutoffjeanspodcast.
Thank you so much, my Janginis.
And now, on with the show. Is your family tree a mystery? Are you fascinated by genealogy? Well, hip, hip, hooray, let's talk DNA with Julie.
The truth is in your genes.
In CutOff Jeans.
Welcome to CutOff Jeans, the podcast that helps you find your truth using nothing but DNA. I'm Julie Dixon Jackson. I'm a genetic genealogist, henceforth known as a Jangini.
And I am Richard Castle, the co-host and producer of this podcast. Julie, did you feel the earthquake last night?
I did indeed.
Did it wake you up?
It woke me up, but you know what's weird? Once I was awake, I felt the shaking, the trembling, like it felt like the bed was vibrating, more than anything. But as I was waking up, it sounded like there was somebody on a skateboard on the sidewalk outside of my window.
Huh. Wow.
And I'm wondering if that was an imagined thing or like some weird, I don't know. It was very strange.
Or a coincidence. Like maybe there was.
Maybe there was. Somebody skateboarding at 2:00 in the morning outside my window. I mean, stranger things have happened.
Yes.
Like a car flipped over at 3 a.m.
Exactly.
Once. So, yeah.
And those were both earthquake unrelated.
Yes, both.
Yeah, it was kind of wild. Like it woke me up and it scared the dog enough that he wanted to come into the bed, which he never does.
Oh, it did?
Oh, yeah. But that's fine. You know, if we have a lot of little ones, I'm cool with it. Just let's keep them small.
Exactly. I was saying to somebody earlier, I feel like the more little ones we have, the more pressure it's taking off the fault or whatever that
I'd
is.
like to believe
I have no
that.
idea how much science is behind that.
I'd like to believe it, but it's probably not true because there's so many faults. Like us, we have a lot of faults.
We have a lot of faults too. And sometimes we just have to let out a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
Oh, never mind. So I was thinking about the whole earthquake thing and that my house has been here since 1928 and has been through several earthquakes and has suffered no structural damage ever even from the big one in the 90s. And to segue from that, I was suddenly thinking about this house. We are the third family that has ever lived in this house.
Oh, wow.
And we bought the house from a family where the father had died, but they'd been here since the 40s. And the woman we bought it from was an actress in Peyton Place.
Really?
Her name was Patricia Morrow, and there were some weird. She's still alive? And there was like there were weird closets built in the house because apparently she had a lot of costumes that were kept here, something like that. That's what we were told anyway. But I suddenly thought I wanted to know, like maybe on Ancestry I can find out some history about my house.
Oh, wow.
Because I've always been curious to find out because it's kind of a landmark in our neighborhood. So I started to build out her family tree, basically, because I thought, because that could somehow. And I discovered not only was she an actress, but her mother-in-law was Rosalind Russell.
Oh, my gosh.
And she and her now ex-husband, Rosalind's son, got married at St. Charles Church right over here in North Hollywood, the big Catholic church. They got married there.
So Rosalind Russell may have been in your house at one time.
Rosalind Russell may have been in this house. In fact, probably was.
Right.
I'm sure there was an engagement party here or something.
That is so cool.
Isn't that cool?
Yeah, that is really neat. I don't know if I mentioned this on the podcast, but I used to live in Long Beach, and I lived in the first place I lived in was a fourplex. And it was an old Spanish built in the 20s, sort of like yours, except they were apartments. And in the little breakfast nook, there was an ironing board that folded up into the wall.
Yep.
And behind it, when you brought it down, there was the house rules or typewritten.
Oh, you have talked about this.
Okay.
Yes. But wasn't there like a weird rule? What were they again?
No radios after 8 p.m. Children had to come in through the back.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh.
And then at one point, someone came over and said that she had grown up in that apartment years ago. And that was, I know, it was cool. She was a neat lady. And so I love the history of just as we talk about history of people, that is also everybody had to live somewhere. And so the places we live, if they're not new, all come with a history as well.
And that is one thing, that is another thing that I was able to do. So then I found the 1950 census for the Morrow family who were living in this at this address.
Yeah.
At the time, which was fascinating. And I also looked all around to see who was living in this neighborhood. There were far less houses here in the 1950s.
Right.
Like this. In fact, we were told this was the very first house built, and it was a guest house on a walnut grove.
Really? Your house is pretty big. It's amazing that would be a guest house.
Well, it was added to in the 60s.
Oh, okay.
So it was always a two-story Spanish, but it stopped at the kitchen. And then they built on an extension, which had another bedroom upstairs and a family room in the middle. And then the garage, which is my husband's shop now, Wow. But it has a lot of, fun things about it.
That's so neat.
All right.
If any of our listeners want to, put a post on the Facebook page, like the history, if they know the history of their homes, that'd be great. Yeah, it's fun.
Yeah. There were so many things I wanted to talk about, so I have to pick and choose today. And this is the first one I want to talk about because it bugged me. So Dr. Phil, his show was entitled DNA Surprises last week. And so, of course, everybody like me had to tune in to see what he had to say about that. And it was interesting. I found it fascinating that at the beginning of the show, he always says this is a safe place to talk about hard things. But it's only a safe place if you agree with him. It seems to be. Right. So here's what happened. The first guest was a woman she was an NPE. Basically, her parents had died, and then they took a DNA test for fun. She and her sisters, and it turned out they were half siblings, and she had a different father.
Okay.
And she figured out who her dad was. Actually, he was a karate teacher or something that her mother had mentioned once as a joke, like maybe he was your father, but he actually was her father. Anyway, and she talked about reaching out on Facebook to him, and when he didn't see his messages or anything, then she reached out to his kids. And Dr. Phil's first response was, wait a minute, what made you think that was a good idea? And his thinking was, so he was shaming her. Here he goes. He said, Dr. Phil shamed the guest by saying, did it ever occur to you that might not be the best idea? The fact that he didn't give her enough credit that she would be tactful and kind and maybe not just blurt out the information was insulting and condescending.
Wow. How did the guest respond to that?
Oh, she kind of laughed it off. Here's the thing. This is a subject that people take very seriously, especially people that are in it, especially with all the DNA surprises that have happened since the advent of
consumer
DNA testing. Yes. And but he kind of made it about, he kept polling his audience, how many of you would take a DNA test after hearing this? And then after each story, he's now how many of you would take a DNA test after this? You know what I mean? He was his basic message was, if you don't want to open up a can of worms, don't do it. Never looking at from the point of view of the person who it directly affected or whose life was a lie.
Right.
Never acknowledging that as a human being, they have a right to know their history and how they got here.
So he was coming from it from like the point of I wouldn't want someone to come up to me and tell me that they were related to me if I didn't.
Well, maybe he's afraid of having kids come out of the woodwork for himself.
Maybe.
I'm sure it's possible.
And I'm sure there are a lot of people who do feel that way. A lot of men in particular who played around.
Of course there are. Right. Another guest, this was a really interesting one because it was something that a lot of people don't know is a possibility, and it actually is a phenomenon. This woman had been a surrogate for a couple and had twins for them. They were very clearly fraternal twins, and they looked very different. Like immediately there was a question like, one of these things is not like the other because the surrogate's husband was black.
And she was white.
Okay. And one of those twins was a lot darker than the other one. Mm-hmm. So, and it was a few weeks before, I guess, the parents who had hired her as a surrogate reached out or somehow started questioning whether or not that baby was theirs.
Okay.
So the DNA test was done. It was revealed that the twins were not genetically related to each other or to the parents who hired the surrogate. So the agency removed the baby from that household. I don't know where that baby was. I'm so sad for that baby.
So was it the surrogate's husband's baby?
Yes. But so they had to do another DNA test, but while they were waiting for those results, that baby was in 2 months in foster care somewhere.
Oh, that's unfortunate. Yike.
And then it was, yes, it was theirs, but they couldn't get their own child. Like the surrogacy agency kind of like held that kid hostage until they decided who it belonged to.
Gosh.
It's horrible. And then the third one, and this is something I think we've talked about before, and you'll know why when this woman who was adopted found out that her father was on the FBI's most wanted list for killing his wife, mother, and 3 sons. And she found out, and this is how I know we've talked about it before, she also found out that the day that he did that was the day that she was crowned Miss Stoughton, 1976. Do you remember that?
This is very familiar. Yes.
Because you're from Stoughton. For the listeners, Richard is from Stoughton, Massachusetts.
Yes.
And so that is the first thing that whenever I hear that town, I think of you immediately.
Yeah.
And I know we've talked about this
I remember
before,
this now. And I don't remember, when I was growing up, I never remember any Miss Stoughton contest. But that isn't surprising. I would have had nothing to do with any kind of beauty contest at that age anyway, or actually at any age, even now.
It wasn't a beauty contest. It was a scholarship contest.
Oh, of course. That's right. Honestly, the only entry into the world of beauty contest or scholarship contest, pageants
yes.
was with you, Julie.
I know.
When I played for your, played piano and accompanied your singing when you were Miss Garden Grove.
Yes, that is correct.
I just realized that when I said that I had nothing to do with any pageants, that I was.
Oh,
that
yes, you did.
I neglected. Here I am talking to the person who introduced me, who was the beginning and end of my career in pageants.
The beginning and end. Yes. Let me see. Oh, Dr. Phil. Oh, yes, Dr. Phil. Oh, this is interesting. He used a list of things to consider when taking a DNA test. It has since come to. What's the word I want to say?
The forefront?
Yes, that this list actually is a list that was done by Christina Bryan Fitzgibbons of Sex, Lies, and the Truth, which is another podcast about DNA.
Okay.
And DNA surprises. And she had compiled that list as a list of things for people to think about, but not a caution, not a like, if you can't handle this,
right? I see.
Then don't do this. It was more like, here are the possibilities that may happen
Yeah.
that you need to be prepared for, as opposed to don't do these things. You know what I mean? Yeah. So I thought that was interesting.
It's an interesting perspective because, yes, it is probably a good idea to know what you're getting into in terms of what
Absolutely.
of the possibility.
Informed consent.
Yes, exactly. Mm-hmm. But not looking at it like, oh, be careful what you wish for.
Right.
I mean, there is that.
Right.
There is always that side to anything, you know.
Certainly.
But
yeah.
I guess it's sort of just the intent from where you're coming from. Is it like, I want you to have this knowledge, or watch out.
Right, and you are going to ruin somebody else's life just by your existence.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, he made it more about protecting people's privacy and status quo while never considering that every human being has a fundamental right to their own genetic history. He even said, be prepared for that biological parent to not want you to contact his other kids, his other kids, never making the connection that his other kids are your half-siblings.
Right.
And they also have a right to know of your existence.
Yes. It's very old school thinking, isn't it? That because I feel like this is especially since the advent of consumer DNA testing, that this is
it's a different world and we've moved on from the shame and the skeletons in the closet, because none of that is going to...
Right. Well, I mean, we have, but not everyone has moved on from that, is the point.
Apparently not Dr. Phil either.
I think we should take a break.
Oh, okay.
If you're enjoying our podcast, please subscribe, rate, and review, or consider supporting us on our Patreon page, patreon.com/CutOff Genes Podcast. Now back to Julie and me.
All right, we are back.
Hello.
So it's no secret that my genetic genealogy business has been a little slow lately. I haven't had any active cases of late, so now's a good time to reach out to me, guys. In fact, I was so bored last weekend that I put a Facebook message saying the first person to contact me gets 3 hours of my time to look at your DNA.
Wow.
Because I was just like, I feel I need to do something constructive with my time. And I just had an overwhelming desire to work on some genealogy. So somebody did reach out to me. Actually, the first person to reach out to me was Holly Grass, she was a former guest. She's told her story on the podcast before. And she has a friend named Tiffany who she's been helping, but they were stuck. And she thought that maybe another set of eyes would help to come to, get more information about this. So Tiffany's dad, we're going to name him Orville. She said it was fine to use real names on this, but I'm going to, some of the ones, like her dad is not involved in this, so I'm not using his real name. He found out at the age of 70, that he was adopted.
Wow.
This is after his parents were already deceased. And he petitioned the courts for his records, and miraculously, they were granted the records. And so the records gave a lot of information. He was actually 2 when he was adopted. He had no clue about this. And looking at the records, it appears that he was given his purported father's original name, but was a junior. It said that he was 100% Puerto Rican. And it gave both names of the purported parents and said that there were 2 older siblings. The sister, they were taken away from the mother. I guess the parents were estranged. They were taken away from her for gross neglect. There were some stories in the papers that were awful about the kind of neglect. So he has a relative. The way he found out was a cousin contacted him after his parents died and told him. So it was another one of those situations where everybody in the family knows about it but you.
Oh, that's so... Oh,
I know.
So sad. I mean...
It's awful. It's awful.
It's such a betrayal, and particularly after the parents are gone, because then you can't even talk to them about it. You can't even say, why didn't you tell me?
What were you thinking? Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Like, just to hear their reasons. Not that there's a reason, but like just to know rather than have this like feeling that they lied to you all those years. You know?
Yeah, it is. It's a betrayal. It's hard to wrap your head around it. And so because of that, her dad he petitioned the courts. He got that information, but is not taking a DNA test and is still kind of upset about it and doesn't want to be involved. He's kind of like washed his hands of it, I guess, for now. Anyway, but Tiffany has tested. So I was using her DNA, or we have been using her DNA, not her dad's. So you have to look at it differently that way because it's a generation removed and there's a lot, her mom's DNA was in there as well. So I had to. So the first thing I noticed was that, yes, there was Puerto Rican DNA in there, but the other line was very clearly Mexican, not Puerto Rican. And the man that she was told was Orville's father. His name was Orta, and he was supposedly Puerto Rican. But that name was not in any of the matches. And in fact, the mother's maiden name, was also not in any of the matches. So we had two separate lines, neither of which had the names that were reported in the adoption papers. Okay?
Okay.
In having this information, they had found a 1940 census. So Orville was born in late 1940 in San Mateo, California. Tiffany or Holly had found the 1940 census and found this family in San Mateo. They'd found the mother using her married name. Her name was Jenny, and the two older siblings. And she was obviously pregnant with Orville at that time.
Okay.
In San Mateo. So that was already in the tree. So I decided to focus first on the Mexican line. And there was a predominant name. It was Alarcon. In fact, the top match of all the matches was 625 centimorgans to Tiffany, that suggests that match may be a half uncle to her. Or a half-sibling to her dad. There were lots of other matches that had this name.
But you knew that he had siblings, the father had siblings, because in that census it said that the woman that lived at that address had two children.
Oh, yes, they knew, and the papers said that he had siblings. In fact, they knew what happened to one of them. The other, I think, went into foster care.
I see.
But we already knew where one of those matches was. Like the sister that was adopted out, there was already a match connected to her. So we'd already identified that line.
Okay.
Do you know what I'm saying?
Yes.
Okay. So I soon figured out that a lower match of 99 centimorgans was on Facebook, and I messaged her, and she responded immediately, miraculously. Yeah. And she confirmed that her father was that top match, 625 centimorgans. So I was able to build the tree out from there, from her and him, and then, there were other Alarcon matches. So a concern was that this match, the match for the daughter, was significantly lower than what you would expect in a half first cousin, which is what she would be to Tiffany if their fathers were half brothers.
Right.
Suggests that one of them was an outlier, like she just happened to not inherit as much DNA from that line, which is possible, not likely, but possible. Okay. That's why it's called an outlier. Or that the high matching father maybe matches more than one line, therefore skewing the numbers to higher than traditional.
Gotcha.
Okay. So I built out the tree as much as possible. They had come from Mexico and moved around the West Coast. They started in Texas and then ended up settling in Los Angeles. But in 1940, they had been in San Mateo. This was her father's family.
Okay.
The match, the 99 centimorgan match.
Yeah.
They were in this household in San Mateo in 1940.
Okay.
And I found them in the census. And as I'm looking at the census, and I'm studying it, as I always do, because it's very important to really study the census, I realized that the street they lived on was ringing a bell. It sounded familiar. Further investigation showed that this family, if I were just to look a little bit further down on the list, these two families live next door to each other. Huh. So this Alarcon family was living next door to the biological mother.
Okay.
In 1940, they literally lived next door to each other. That's what we call a smoking gun. Because, of course, I mean, what are the odds that could possibly... So it has to be one of those sons. It can't be their father because he was already dead. He died in 1925.
All right.
So it has to be either the high match on Ancestry, the 625, which is the right, or his brother. But we had other matches that were great-grandchildren of the brother. So it's possible that either of those sons could be Orville's dad. But on DNA Painter, I plugged it all into Watto, and it's 36 times more likely that it would be the father of this high match on Ancestry than his uncle.
Okay.
So we don't know for sure. We're still in a place, there are still more things to explore. We're still hoping this 99 centimorgan match will share her DNA with me or us so that I can see how she matches other people and see, because there are some matches that we haven't spoken to that we haven't been able to identify who they are. That could change things. But the smoking gun right now is literally these two families living next door to each other.
Wow.
So we're very, very close.
You did all that in 3 hours?
Well, no. I mean, I was planning on it, but as is my way. But there's more.
Oh, okay.
Let's go back to Jenny, the mother. So they were told on the papers, on the legal papers, her name was, Jenny Melendo or Jenny Melando.
Okay.
This name, once again, we know that she was the Puerto Rican one for sure. No Melendos or anything like that in the matches, and a lot of matches on that line as well. Holly had built out these loose branches in order to connect to each other, but a lot of it was not connecting to each other, and we couldn't find any Melendos in there. I went back and I did more of a search for the father. That was not really the father. We know that now, of Orta. And I actually found a 1937 newspaper announcement for San Mateo for marriage license applications. So his name was Amado Orta, the purported father who was not the father.
Right.
There was a marriage application in 1937 in Half Moon Bay, which is right there in San Mateo, for Amado Orto and a Jean Mateo. They lived right there. It's the exact right time. I went back and looked at those trees, at those matches from that line. There's Mateo all over the place.
Wow.
It was Mateo. The name Melendo was completely made up.
I see.
And put in the official records.
Wow.
Who knows who had lied, but somebody had lied in the adoption places, in the adoption papers. So the highest match on the Mateo line was consistent with a half granduncle, meaning a half sibling to Jenny.
Yeah.
And we're assuming that's what it was. There are other matches on that line that are still unidentified as well. So there's still more to figure out, but we've unmasked a lot of the wrong information. But the real find was the 1940 census with the two families literally living next door to each other. That broke the whole case wide open for me anyway. It's one of those things where I scream into like the abyss because nobody knows what I'm doing.
No, that's fascinating, though. That,
Yeah.
You're like a little detective, aren't you?
It feels so good.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and that there are still puzzle pieces missing, but you know what they are.
And there are lots of matches that we have still not spoken to or have not responded or I've not figured out who they are, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, it is certainly, and yes, it became a much more than just a 3-hour analysis. But, so now, guys, the first thing you need to do is keep your eyes on the Facebook page in case I get bored.
Right.
And second, my business is pretty slow right now. So now is the time to get a good deal if you need help.
Let's take a break.
Okay.
Thank you for listening to CutOff Jeans with Julie Dixon Jackson and Richard Castle. You can support us by going to patreon.com/CutOff Jeans podcast. Now, back to the program.
Okay, this is story time. This week we have Lynn Grubb, who is a private infant adoptee from the Illinois area, and she is going to tell us the first half of her story now.
Great, let's listen in.
Hi, everybody. I have on the line Lynn Grubb, who is a closed area Illinois adoptee. She's the editor of the Adoptee Survival Guide and also the author of Hidden Identity, an audible memoir. Hi, Lynn.
Hey, Julie. Thanks for having me today.
You're welcome. Thanks for being here. I've seen your name for years, and obviously we're in many of the same groups. And
yeah, I've been around a while.
Yeah, I finally reached out. I'm like, this person should definitely be on the podcast. So I would like for you to share your story with me and also the listeners. And you can start wherever you feel is an appropriate place to start.
Okay. Well, let's see. In 1990, many, many moons ago, I requested my non-identifying information because, as you mentioned, I was raised in a closed adoption and I didn't know anything about my family. And at that time, I learned from the Cradle Adoption Agency, where I was adopted in Illinois.
Oh, the Cradle. Yes.
The Cradle.
I've heard
and I'm sure you have. Mm-hmm. I learned that my mother had not made any contact with the agency. At that time, I was engaged and feeling like, well, I guess she doesn't want to know me. Mm. So I kind of put it all on the back burner at that time. So it wasn't until I was in my late 30s, many, many years later, that I decided I wanted to start searching for her.
Okay.
And that happened around 2004 or 5. I started really digging in. I even petitioned the Illinois court to try to get my records. Oh, not well.
It never does. I love how people think, oh, you can just petition the court, but it never works out well.
I had read a bunch of forums online that said if you have your mother sign the paperwork, you might be able to get your file open.
Your biological mother?
No, my adoptive mother.
Oh, so that because they're more worried about her feelings than yours.
Yeah. So, okay. Basically she approves of this message.
Right. Right.
But that didn't work. The judge did say in his decision that I was entitled to my medical records, but unfortunately, there weren't really any other than I didn't have any inherited diseases. So that was kind of a dead end for me. Mm-hmm. So then I started researching the Cradle more and looking online, and I realized that the Cradle offered post-adoption services.
Okay.
So I hired them to find her.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So back then it was $500. That was 2006.
Yeah. Probably $2,000 now.
Well, it's actually $250 now. They reduced it probably because I've said enough times it's too much money.
Right, and they probably realized that they're not the only game in town as well.
True, and the confidential intermediary in Illinois dropped their fee altogether. So I think that might have had something to do with it.
Oh, well, that's good. That's good news.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I hired them, and I was told there's no guarantee. If we don't find her, you don't get your money back.
Right.
If she says, no, we can't reveal her name, you don't get your money back. Mm-hmm. So it was definitely a gamble, but one I was willing to take because by then I was 40 years old. Mm-hmm. So a week later, the social worker called me, and she had found her. And I was ecstatic and happy, and we had a reunion.
Okay, so she was willing. Obviously, there wasn't difficult to get her to agree. That's good.
No, she sent me a nice letter, told me some things about my family, and then we met at Ocean City, Maryland for a reunion.
Okay.
And that's where it got a little weird, and that's a big part of my memoir is what happened there.
Okay.
And but the long and short of it is, we had a good time, but she said she didn't know who my father was.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah. You've probably heard this before.
Well, my mother said she did know who my father was, but she was wrong. So there's that
wow.
too.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, by the time we get our age, we've been in enough adoption support groups, and we hear that these stories repeat a lot.
Yeah.
But back then, I didn't have like a support group, so I didn't know what to make of it. It was, well, I met him at a party, but I didn't know him. I'm like, okay, all right. So that, we ended our reunion, and we all went back to our normal lives, and I just kind of let it drop for a while.
Did you stay in touch with her?
I did for several years.
Yeah.
And then we had a falling out because I pushed the issue.
Mm-hmm.
But what really ended our reunion is when it was politics, and this was pre-Trump. This was 2008 when
Obama won.
And yes. Yeah. And she's very Republican and I'm not.
Oh boy.
So she called me up one day and baited me. I feel like she baited me about politics. And somehow we got on the topic of abortion.
Uh-huh.
And I'm pro-choice.
Right.
And she's not.
Right.
And so at some point in the conversation, she said, you should feel grateful that I didn't abort you.
Uh-huh.
And I was just floored. I was like, what?
Yeah.
Are you kidding me? And she said, my brother agrees, as if that's, more backup for her statement.
Her brother agrees?
Her brother agrees. I should be grateful I wasn't aborted.
Oh, nice to know she's been talking to her brother about that. Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I hung up the phone. I ran bathwater. I got in the tub and I just sat there and cried.
Oh.
And then I called my husband and he was just like, I don't know what to think about any of this, but he was sympathetic. And I think I just decided that day I was done.
Yeah.
And so then I avoided calls and stopped writing, and she lives in another state. So I just let it fizzle. We never really discussed what happened.
Right.
I just let it fade into the sunset.
Okay.
So that's my reunion story.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's a lot more detail.
I'm
but
sure.
You guys can check out my Audible memoir and get all the dirt.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. It's interesting because I that happens a lot. And I think for me, my reunion hasn't fallen apart on my maternal side. Cause I mean, and this is not to say my mother is a bad person. She's absolutely not. But she lives in another country and it's just easier to not have that obligation.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like, well, I couldn't go over there and visit her anyway. So it certainly makes it easier for me. So I'm always fascinated when I hear about people where people are just more accessible, I guess.
Yes. And she is at least a couple states away from me.
Right.
But it's not like I could just swing by or she could swing by. And I think I live in Ohio, and she had a real aversion to coming here. And I don't know why.
Ohio?
Because her nephew lives here in the same community as me.
Okay.
And we're friends. And I thought, well, she could kill two birds with one stone. She could visit him and she could visit me. And I had these visions of, I could take her by all my schools and show her where I grew up.
Yeah.
And she could meet my family. And no, she wanted no part of Ohio. She wanted to go to Las Vegas, but
oh boy,
with me.
Okay.
And I was like, no. I mean, it was in the middle of the school year. I had kids in school. I couldn't do it.
Right.
So we were just in different places. Also, she was in her 60s, so she was empty nesting and wanting to travel, and
right.
Was in a different stage of her life.
Yeah.
And I was raising kids. So it really we didn't jive.
Yeah.
And that we didn't jive personality wise either.
Yeah. Okay.
So there was just, I don't know. I kind of left that reunion with, maybe I'm more like my father's people.
Right. Yes. I get that. Okay. So let's go forward in time to where you decided to start looking for your father.
Okay. Well, I wanted to know who he was, but there was no way for me to find out who he was because
that
she
time.
didn't have a name, right?
Right.
And I couldn't get any more info from my adoption file. I did get a little bit of info, but not enough to really help me identify a name.
Right. And also, especially on the paternal side, that sometimes it's not true.
Oh, so often. You're
Very
right.
often, it's just not true.
Yeah.
You don't
In
know
fact,
what to believe.
it might have been a benefit that I had that there was no name in the file. The social worker told me there was no name.
Right.
And then there was no actual information about their relationship, which seems unusual to me now.
Yeah.
Because I see so many other adoptees non-ID, but there just wasn't much about him. There was his college, his age, where he was supposedly from, and just a few tidbits, but nothing about their relationship or why they weren't together, etc.
Yeah. Okay.
So I didn't have that, and this is before autosomal DNA really became a thing,
Right.
But I was writing for Lost Daughters, an online website for adopted women, and I was paired up with Richard Hill, the author of what is his book called?
Finding Family.
Finding Family.
Yeah.
Thank you. The Secrets in My DNA.
What do you mean by you were paired up with him?
I was asked to read and review his book and interview him.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
That's fun.
So I did read his book. I did interview him, and I literally had hope for the first time. That was 2012.
Okay.
So that was many years after I met my birth mom.
Right. That was about when I started looking for my father, too. Well, not looking,
really?
but when I started seriously and when I started dabbling in DNA as well.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, we're kind of on the same trajectory, it seems.
Yeah.
So after I finished his book, I was like, I'm doing it. And my husband got some kind of refund check he wasn't expecting, and he handed it to me, and he was like, here you go for your DNA test.
Aw.
He's a sweetie.
Yeah.
So I tested at Family Tree.
Right.
That was the first one I tested at. And I matched with this guy named Greg, and I talk more about Greg in my memoir. He was my first search angel.
Okay.
He was like a distant cousin, and he and I got into conversations, and I mentioned my story to him, and he's like, well, I would be really happy to help you.
Yeah.
And he lived in the area of my birth family in the Chicago area. So I called him my boots on the ground guy. He would do some research at the libraries, things I couldn't find online. So he came up with a profile, kind of like a criminal profile, but not a criminal. He created a profile of my father.
How do you do that?
He just took all the facts and he just wrote it up. And he said, this is what I think based on the age, based on my DNA, based on the revelation that he was Latino, which I didn't know.
Oh, okay.
So he came up with this whole profile. He was supposedly working in advertising. That was a my non-ID. He could have been in the war. Like he came up with all sorts of possibilities about my father. Yeah. So that was helpful to me. It gave me a little bit of hope of, okay, this is a guy who could have these qualities that we're looking for.
Right.
So then I tested at 23andMe after that, and Greg suggested my son also test. He explained it to me why,
he
but
wouldn't get the why.
No, it wasn't the why, but he gave me all the DNA reasons. At that time, I didn't understand any of it, so I won't even try to explain. And then the next year, I tested at Ancestry, and then that got transferred to MyHeritage, and I just didn't have any close matches in any of the databases.
Yeah, I didn't at first either. Yeah.
So that was disheartening, of course. So then I had this idea to create a search team. And so I created this closed Facebook group that I called Searching for Julio.
Oh, wow.
Because a friend of my birth mom let it slip to Greg in an interview that his name was Julio.
Oh.
Okay. So I created this room, the search room, and I invited friends from the adoption community, genealogist friends, nosy friends, good diggers, just anybody who was interested in my story and wanted to help.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of the beginning of really digging in based on what Greg was able to dig up from interviews about my father.
Okay.
And so we started looking at different colleges because we were told he was in college. He was an international student.
Oh.
He was supposedly from Bogota, Colombia.
Oh.
And so I know. So we kept getting all these clues.
That
and I'm like,
probably,
well, how many?
That's probably one of the reasons why the DNA wasn't showing much.
Yes,
Oh,
exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
So I'm just getting these pieces, parsed out. And thank God for Greg, because honestly, I was a chicken back then. Now I would literally call anyone and ask anything.
Yeah, I
But
used
back
to do
then,
that.
I was a chicken. Such a chicken. I'm like, no, I can't ask them that. He would just do it for me.
Yeah, I used to do that too.
So then let's see what happened. Okay, so years pass. And then in 2019, I get a third cousin match at 23andMe.
Okay.
But this woman isn't from Colombia. She's American. She lives in D.C., but her roots are in Peru.
Okay.
And it's the closest match I have. So my team and I build out a tree, and it pretty much leads to nowhere. At some point, the records just stop.
Yeah.
So we don't know what to do with that. 2020, I get a second cousin match at Ancestry.
All right, that's where we're leaving off with Lynn's story. We'll hear the second half in episode 703.
I am Richard Castle, and if you are so inclined, you can look me up at my website, richardcastle.com, or you can follow me on the Twitter or on Instagram at Castle Songs.
I'm Julie Dixon Jackson. You can find everything me at cutoffjeans.com on all the socials. Join the Facebook page. If you are a client or a former client or somebody who I have just helped, you could help me by going to cutoffjeans.com or Jules Jackson Genetic Genealogist on the Facebook page and providing a review. Or I'm going to put a Google link to my Google business listing, and you can also put a review on there, which would be very helpful for my business.
Or you could review this podcast on Apple Podcasts as well.
Please, and subscribe and rate.
Well, before we go, Julie, you need to tell everybody what the truth is and where it is.
Well, guys, you may already know this, but I'm just going to repeat it. The truth is in your genes.